High Noon on News Talk.
You're very welcome back to High Noon. Kieran Cuddihy standing in today. 53106 is the text number, or you can get us on Twitter at High Noon NT. Now, Germans went to the polls, we know, over the weekend, and Angela Merkel has secured a fourth term as German Chancellor. However, her power has been significantly diminished after a shock surge in support for the far-right Alternative Party in Germany, the AfD, having secured 13% of the vote. It marks the first time in almost 6 decades that an openly right-wing nationalist party will enter the Bundestag. To explain the import of all of this, I'm joined in studio by Tom Molloy, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at Trinity College. Tom, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kieran.
Let's talk about Angela Merkel first. Let's get this out of the way before we talk about the AfD. Is this securing her legacy, as Germany's most successful politician in recent times, or how badly damaged is she by this showing?
Well, you can't really call her Germany's most successful politician in recent times, because she, by being returned for a fourth time, she's merely repeating what Helmut Kohl did in the past. And I think, like all politicians who go on and on and on, they always see a kind of diminution towards the end. So it was almost inevitable. But what's really interesting here, Kieran, is what happens next. Even today, the CSU, which is a sister party of the CDU that kind of contests elections on behalf of the CDU in Bavaria, has kind of talked for the first time about splitting up from the CDU. That's never happened before. That would be a complete kind of earthquake in German politics. So if that's her legacy, I think within her party,
it's seen as it's only been a branding difference.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly. No one bothers to make any kind of distinction because CSU in Bavaria, CDU everywhere else. It's just two parties. Everybody understands the way it works. So that would be really something quite extraordinary, and it just shows you how upset people are about these elections, and it shows you how difficult Merkel's job now is, because the CSU are essentially complaining that Merkel is not right-wing enough, that by moving to the left, by allowing in refugees, by abolishing nuclear power and so on, she's kind of created a vacuum that the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, has kind of filled. So they want to push Merkel rightwards, but her other coalition partners, especially the Greens, but also the Free Democrats, they will want to push her into the centre. So she's now torn by different flanks within her own party and the demands of the coalition partners. So it's very difficult to see how she's going to square this.
She has been in a grand coalition up until this election, with kind of an unusual situation then where they were, I suppose, competing then, herself and Martin Schulz taking part in only one TV debate. I think he wanted more. The Social Democrats, though, say they're going to go into opposition, which means that Angela Merkel and the CDU and CSU, while they're still together, have to find coalition parties. Will it be, as you say, Free Democrats and the Greens? Is that the only options?
I think it is. It's a little bit like the government talks here 2 years ago. You kind of, it seems very confusing. But when you look at it, if the SPD really won't go into government with the CDU, well, then it has to be the other two. It's just going to be a very, very difficult negotiation process. And Merkel is talking about this taking until Christmas. German politics moves very slowly. Germans are used to incredibly tedious kind of negotiations, whether it's industrial relations or whether it's politics or anything else. So it won't unduly worry the Germans. I think it will worry quite a lot of other Europeans. We're at an interesting kind of juncture at the moment, and to have Europe's superpower, to have the country that really powers the European Union distracted and engaged in kind of internal talks, it'll slow down progress. I mean, the two things I think, well, the one thing for an Irish audience that's really big is that Brexit will be off the agenda for several months. I mean, how can Germany talk about Brexit if it doesn't know what kind of government there is? And I think, when it comes to European integration, almost certainly the FDP are sceptical and the Greens are sceptical for different reasons. So the CDU is always been the party of European integration and the party of Europe in German politics. And now it's being attacked from the left and attacked from the right. It's likely to kind of put a pause on European integration. I think that will probably please a lot of people in government who were concerned that an alliance between Germany and France might lead to deeper defence ties and that kind of thing. I think that's off the table now. Not just until Christmas. It's off the table for the next German government.
Why no grand coalition again?
Well, this is a phenomenon that just keeps on repeating itself, isn't it? You go into a coalition with a big party and you come out just utterly demolished, and it's happened to the SPD. The SPD are, they are one of the great political parties of Europe. They were around in the 30s. They were the only people who voted against Hitler when he came to power. They were punished and tortured and put in concentration camps. They see themselves as one of the great parties, not without reason. to be languishing at 20.5% in the polls, to only have got 1 in 5 votes, it must be desperately disappointing for them. And they're drawing the lessons. And perhaps, you could say the resurgence or the appearance of the AfD tells us that Germany needs a proper kind of opposition, that it isn't healthy for democracy for the two largest parties to kind of be in government for 8 years in a row, and it would it's about time that Germany had a proper opposition again.
The AfD would be the default opposition, I suppose, if there was a grand coalition.
That's right.
Who are the AfD?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because 3 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, it started off really as a party that was opposed to bailouts, and it was set up by a load of academics, quite decent people who were just fundamentally opposed to the kind of bailouts that this country got, and particularly the bailouts that were given to Greece. And then it morphed into an anti-immigrant party. The bailout issue is not the live issue it once was for the Germans as much as for ourselves. And it was kind of hijacked by a really pretty unpleasant crew of people. So it's always had at least two identities. It's had this kind of fiscal rectitude kind of thing that plays well with a vast number of Germans. Then it has a kind of an anti-migrant thing, which plays well in most societies with about half the population. And, got a huge boost from Merkel's decision to allow so many refugees from Syria and elsewhere to come into the country 2 or 3 years ago. So that's what it is. And this morning, only hours after they won this kind of stunning result, one of the co-leaders of the AfD resigned. And she comes from that kind of responsible part of from the part of the party that pushes fiscal responsibility. She's not a racist, although she's not exactly right on left-winger either. And, the fact that she's resigned shows you that it's a very weird coalition in its own right.
Yeah, we saw that. I was watching the press conference earlier when she kind of stood up and said she wouldn't be taking her seat with the party and walked out. Is that a rejection then of the direction and that hijacking, as you said, that took place within the party, of that fiscally conservative wing? Are we likely then to see, say, if her voice isn't heard, that essentially the party moves even further away from that fiscally conservative core that was there at its origins and moves further right towards the anti-Islamization and anti-ever closer union?
Yeah, I think that's probable, but it is too early to say. She hasn't even really given a proper explanation for why she chose to leave the party. And anyway, we've known for some time now that really all the dialogue, all the discussion in the elections was around migration. So, that's what that party stands for these days. It's just, I suppose, Merkel got a lot of criticism from people in this country and elsewhere for being slow when it came to the bailouts. And there were many reasons for that slowness. But one of them was she's an astute politician. That's why she's lasted so long. And she was always aware that, by bailing us out, by bailing out the Greeks and the Portuguese, that she was leaving that flank open. And this election is a result, to a degree, of those bailouts. And she must kind of think that as she looks around it today.
Is she so astute, though? Did she mismanage the refugee issue? Was she too open about letting in refugees? Was there a way of letting them in, but kind of, I suppose, having the appearance that that you were going to kind of have maybe stricter vetting or some sort of border controls? Did her attitude to the refugee crisis haunt her in the end?
I don't know the answer. I mean, I think that Merkel is who she is. She's somebody who grew up in East Germany behind a wall. Her family were clergymen, so she was personally, unable to study certain subjects in university. She had to do physics because it's a non-political subject. So I think she has, like many Germans, a deep commitment to other refugees. So many Germans were themselves, within living memory, refugees. I don't know if she made a mistake, but, she's paying a political cost. But another thing that's always worth thinking about with this whole refugee issue is, what were the alternatives? People were being literally squashed against fences and walls all over Europe. Those walls were coming down. And I think, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that she also felt she had no choice. Just as the walls came down in 1989, and whatever the East European governments thought, it was just happening to them. She felt this was just happening. These people were either going to be stopped by bullets, or they were going to swarm across the borders and kind of start moving across Europe. So there's another question we have to ask ourselves is, although I suspect that Merkel did it for those reasons, out of an ideological reason or a belief in the need to help refugees in times of crisis, I think she had very little choice in practice.
What do we make of the fact that so much of the support for the AfD came from what would have been East Germany, and areas that really, to an extent, and I don't know Germany well, so this is just based on kind of reports and reading about the elections and over the weekend, the results, that areas that really haven't been actually affected directly by inward migration.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's a very good point, Kieran, because there's a lot of evidence these days to show that the differences between East Germany and West Germany have largely disappeared. If you look at the country through kind of an economic lens or kind of through the usual prisms of deprivation and so on, there's as much deprivation in parts of West Germany, say, as East Germany. But politically, if you look at the map today, it's really stark. The East Germans voted for a left-wing party called Die Linke that is also fairly radical, and they voted for AfD. And West Germany voted for the old conventional parties. And if there is a coalition now, the CDU, the FDP and the Greens, what they're going to call the Jamaica coalition because of the colours of each party representing the Jamaican flag, if there is that kind of coalition, it will be a West German government, and that will be really problematic. I mean, of course, Merkel is an East German herself, but it will almost be like she's a figurehead. It will draw all its support, all its thinking from the West. So the old kind of disagreements, the old ways of thinking have really resurfaced in this election for the first time since unification.
Before we finish, if we kind of cast the net a little wider, we've seen far-right governments doing very well in places like Hungary and Poland, doing reasonably well, politicians in France, in the Netherlands, in Austria, now in Germany, not quite getting there in a lot of those cases, a long way from getting there in Germany, really, but I suppose this historical import to the AfD resurgence. Where does all this go over the next 10, 15 years?
Golly,
tell me exactly now, Tom.
That's a big question, isn't it? No, and the other place you didn't mention is Scandinavia. Scandinavia has gone very far to the right in countries that we traditionally think of as very liberal, like Sweden and Denmark. I don't know. I mean, this is all playing out in front of our eyes, isn't it? And, of course, the States and New Zealand and almost everywhere in the West. But no, I don't know the answer any more than I think anyone else does.
Well, look, Tom Molloy, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at Trinity College. Tom, thanks very much for coming in to us. Plenty of people getting in touch. Someone says the AfD are comprised of economists and academics with the consent of the people. They've been riding on a wave of dispassionate facts and figures. The AfD are the third largest party in Germany. They will be the legacy of Mutti Merkel. Someone else says Ireland, the UK, France, Germany, Greece, the US, etc., all failing to return centre-right parties. If these politicians don't start doing what the people want, the people will put anyone else in power. And I, for one, don't want far-right parties running the world. Please talk about real alternatives, just not how they can come back from this. And someone else says, so is everyone that worries about massive immigration by economic migrants from outside Europe a racist, says Simon? No, Simon, not everyone. A lot of them are. Others are just selfish. Stay with us.